Jeremy Stoddard. Jeremy is a colleague of ours in social studies who teaches at the University of William and Mary. And he is currently the chair, he is the supervisor for the program in secondary social studies, as he alluded to earlier this morning. He is a former middle school teacher, also a professional development coordinator in his previous life, and currently is an assistant professor at the College of William and Mary. His research focuses on the intersection of media, pedagogy, and curriculum, and he's actually working on a new book on teaching history.
It's with the editors, yeah.
Yes, teaching history with film.
Come on, January.
Do you have a title, a working title?
The marketing people changed it to be really bland, and honestly, I can't remember what. It's something literally like teaching history with film.
And I was a reviewer of this book, and it was a terrific book, so I encourage you to check it out when it gets on Amazon or in your local bookstore. So
Rutledge in January.
Rutledge in January. Very good. So please welcome Jeremy Stoddard.
I'm happy to be here, and as Bill said, I was a middle school teacher, so if you do have questions at any point, go ahead and feel free to yell at me. It won't be anything new. And I also did ed tech professional development for a few years in 35 school districts in Wisconsin. So I was the person on the Friday afternoon when everyone wanted to be in their rooms preparing for the first day of school. I was the person forcing them to be in the hot cafeteria doing the workshops. So I've had very tough audiences. So again, feel free to yell out a question if you want. The other night I did one, Colonial Williamsburg has teacher institutes in the summer. And so I did a session on the Friday night, and I met them with dinner first, and they were drinking heavily at dinner, and then I was supposed to do this session on teaching with film afterward. And they were quite good, but it was a very lively session, to say the least. I came to this actually in a number of ways. One was when I was teaching, I was really interested in how film was used and what kids were actually learning from it. Because I had the teachers next door to me, the one that taught the Civil War for 4 months, and would show a bunch of films, and I always wondered, well, what are students really getting out of it? And I'd see the detailed worksheets people use, and have them basically to keep kids watching the film, but I always saw them as a big distraction away from actually trying to get something out of it. So I've been doing research on this for a while now, and the Vietnam connection is interesting. The first film that I made as part of a video production class was a documentary on Vietnam. That was my stepdad, who was a fighter pilot in Vietnam, was shot down twice in North Vietnam, and he's an old Swede, so he makes it sound like it was a good time, being blown out of a plane at hundreds of miles an hour. But he was also rescued by a Hmong detachment that was working for the CIA on one of the occasions, and I was in St. Paul at the time teaching in St. Paul, Minneapolis, where there's a huge Hmong population. So friends of mine that were teaching history in St. Paul used it a number of times, and it brought up the whole issue of the treatment of the Hmong after the war and all sorts of things that were going on there. But the one thing the kids really got a kick out of is he would say Hmong, my stepdad would, and so they would kind of giggle every time he would say Hmong. But that was my first foray into video production, and it made me more critical, I think, of looking at documentaries, because I know I was grabbing stock footage that had nothing to do with what I was doing to try to illustrate what he was saying in videos, and so it gave me a sense more of the choices that documentary filmmakers make, and so that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. And also with the rise of reality television, the ability of anyone in their garage with a computer to make a documentary film now, all these things, there's a lot more documentary films out there, and from some of the research that I've done, a lot more in the classroom. So we're going to look at kind of the social role of what documentaries are in terms of how people learn history, and then also look at how they can be used in the classroom, and hopefully we'll pass on some things to you that you can think about as you're going through and selecting clips and how you're going to use them in the classroom. And so I dubbed this the History Channel effect, not to pick on the History Channel, but I happen to be scanning through a lot lately and somewhat horrified by what's on the History Channel now, including an episode I'll refer to later that was about the problems of having sex in space on one of their programs. That my wife is addicted to Monster Quest, including the New Jersey Devil. Is that right?
Yes.
Is that the one in New Jersey? Yeah. So these things all in the History Channel and Ice Road Truckers or whatever it is and all that. So because of some of the things I've seen in classroom, it really raised it for me. So not to pick on the History Channel, but a little bit. So one of the first things we looked at, and this was a friend of mine, Alan Marcus, and I, is about 7 years ago, we wanted to find out, well, how many films are being used in the classroom and which films are being used? And there was nothing on it. There was some data on numbers of hours of use in the classroom that different films were being used, but nothing really more specific. So we looked at it, and this was a pretty small survey, but it was history teachers in Wisconsin and Connecticut. And we found, and again, people who respond to surveys tend to be people who really care about it, so it's probably a little high, but even then it was shocking to us that basically 93% said they used all or part, and most of them I think were probably clips, of a feature film once a week or more. And 83% of documentary once a week or more. Okay, now these could be, they use the little, history in the day thing at the beginning of each period or something as a warm-up. We don't really know the exact details of it, but they're using, there's a lot of film use being used out in the classroom. And so when I've been doing research on students and what they're getting out of it, this is where, so I'm going to refer to some studies, but also where it's appearing in other parts of the literature. Basically, we found this, what I'm calling the History Channel effect. And I'll just read it quickly. It's the belief many young people have that all forms of documentary, because of, and this isn't just kids, this is people in general, documentary film and video are objective and neutral sources of historical information, and an infliction where people are unable to recognize the value-laden ideological perspectives in most documentary-style film. And this was from research. I was asking students, well, what is the point of the film? What do they want you to believe about it? And they would have no clue. Unless you ask them then to go and say, well, what do you think the point of view is the person that makes it? How's it making you? If you dig a little deeper, then they can start to figure out. But naturally, they aren't looking for kind of the perspectives of it. And so I'm looking at this from 4 different kind of parts that form together this effect. One is this kind of epistemic, this belief about the nature of knowledge, that documentary equals objective in most people's minds. A second part is the social role of media in terms of where we learn our history from. And some of this is included in the one article you're reading from Sam Weinberg and crew, right? That was on your list? They talk a little bit more about this in their piece in terms of the role of film. A third part is the way teachers and authority figures use film that's actually supporting this notion that documentaries are objective. And the fourth is this kind of phenomenon in the last 10, 15 years that making documentaries has become so much cheaper, so much easier to do, that the quality of them in a lot of cases, in one way it's really democratizing in terms of it allows groups that haven't been able to, because it took a lot of money to make film, they've been able to actually bring their voices in. On the other hand, there's also a whole lot of more garbage out there, and it's hard for students and even teachers, I think, sometimes to look at the quality of a documentary, in which case I'm saying, well, look at everything as being kind of from a certain perspective, and then that helps a little bit, but there's some exercises we're going to get into later on in the session that'll get at it. And so this isn't necessarily anything new in terms of that documentaries are biased. It's always been the case, and there's a whole field of educational film analysis that talks about the old anything from some of the family and consumer science, former early home ec films that were very gender laden in terms of the themes that were put out there, from educational films on I'm trying to think, even from the little turtle one on the nuclear, trying to hide under the desk. There's all sorts of things that we know even old educational films have a lot of bias to it. But I think it's been really amplified in today's society because we're using it so much more. So the first one, the epistemic views of documentary film. And this is literally when you start talking with students and you ask them, well, what did you like about the documentary film, or why, which one do you think is more trustworthy? These are the things that you're going to start seeing. They're more trustworthy, it's accurate, it's the truth, it's real, it's neutral, which is something we heard a lot. More complete, it's the real history, it's nothing that's, as compared to feature film, which they will recognize as being not real, although they'll still sometimes talk about it as if it is real, but there's some issues there too. And historian Robert Rosenstone basically explains it this way. He says, the claim is that we can see and presumably feel what people in the past saw and felt. This is what people do when they're watching documentaries. But that's hardly the case, for we can always see and feel much that the people in the photos and newsreels could not see. That their clothing and automobiles were old-fashioned, and that their landscape lacked skyscrapers and other contemporary buildings. That their world was gone, was black and white and haunting and gone. And so basically what he's saying is, when we watch a documentary, we're always watching it from our values, our understandings of the present and what happened. And so therefore we can never truly kind of feel what they felt, but it gives us the sense that we might be able to. In the same way that watching a film on the Holocaust might tend to give you the belief that you know a little bit more about what it would have been to experience that or any other historical event. And so this is the tricky part. So as I'm looking around, and again on the History Channel, I flipped through a lot. One of the things that I included, and a lot of this is included in the article that's posted for the thing that I've been working on. One of the things I noticed was a lot of commercials for a particular video series. And this video series happens to be the same one that the cut film that you're working with has come from. They've been pushing this, selling it a lot lately. And how it's described in the commercial is, this is the real Vietnam, without the spin, without the bias. Right? An objective look into the Vietnam turmoil. And it even compares itself, this is the real Vietnam, not like all those other things that are out there. So even in the ads that we're seeing, they're positioning it as being objective, as being the real Vietnam. And I think you have to look at all of this stuff within the social context of when it's made, too. As someone talked about earlier, I can't remember if it was Bill, looking at 1981 when this TV series was on, it was very close. Still, this is when Hmong and Vietnamese refugees are still coming over. This isn't too many years out from when U.S. soldiers and personnel that were left kind of there working still, that are still, coming over or coming back within, 4 or 5 years after this. So it's still pretty fresh in everyone's mind. So when we watch it today, you probably get a very different look at it than then. And I thought to make this point, I'm going to show you the beginnings of a couple of feature films to show you also how kind of the social and cultural values of when they were made really reflects in the film. So we're going to show a couple clips here of classics. We're going to start with the Green Berets, which how many people have seen the Green Berets? So this is 1968, and it's very much, I wouldn't say this is completely a broad social view, but it reflects at least a certain segment of society at the time. And we're just going to watch the introductory kind of the first chapter here. If I can get this to work.
Now that I turn the lights off on you.
That's all right.
Okay.
Let me just see if this is going to work. So I want you, as we're playing this, just kind of get your gut instinct of what you would make of it at the time if in 1968 you were in a theater watching this. What are they trying to get you to think about from this film? Okay, we're going to stop there.
Yeah, I'll go.
You got it? Okay, thanks. So, and I want you to remember that last scene of the training part, because we're going to compare it to another film that came out later, which has a little different version of kind of the boot camp experience. What types of feelings and things does this clip bring up, especially from watching it from today? And again, this was released in '68.
Like such a strong sense of earnestness of cause. I mean, clearly on the side of right, very earnest about our mission. We have this thing to accomplish, and there's no skepticism about anything.
What else?
It was very reminiscent of, I guess, maybe just the John Wayne connotation, but of westerns and of kind of paving the frontier for democracy, and it was that kind of imagery, at least in the song.
Yeah, the song is very illustrative. That's why I wanted to play the opening credits for you. What else?
Well, I think along the lines of it being very clear that it's right, the use of German, perhaps to call back to World War II and say, it's as clear cut as that was.
Yeah, and you'll notice that it was surprising me when I was watching this again, because about half of them say they speak Norwegian. And I was thinking, in the Cold War, why would they all be speaking Norwegian? Today that just has no context for why we would need soldiers to speak Norwegian. Right now it would be, Farsi and Arabic that they'd be speaking. But then like half of them speak Norwegian because they keep going through all those the men in that one detachment. What else? What other things does it kind of bring up in you? Is this like the Vietnam, when you think of Vietnam films, is this what you picture?
No.
No, it isn't, is it?
It actually feels more like a World War II film that might have come out two decades earlier, with a very competent, well-disciplined detachment of soldiers. You sort of have one soldier representing each ethnic group or each culture, and then you have the tough, no-nonsense, but also sort of humorous, laid-back commander represented by John Wayne. and it feels more like something that would have come out in the late 1940s as opposed to 1967.
It's definitely got that
68.
war film genre and kind of that World War II feel to it,
Right.
doesn't it? And it actually gets more so as you get into the movie, I think. Bill, what else did you have?
Same thing.
Yeah, so definitely it feels like a different era. When you think today of kind of Vietnam War film, this probably isn't what you're picturing, but this is what was coming out in 1968. And this is something, one of the other, I think I gave you that book chapter, right? The Aufderhardy one?
Yes.
Yeah.
She wrote a chapter, and she called them the version that came out kind of in the 1980s, all these films that were made, the noble grunt genre, because it reflected a different societal view. And so I'm going to show just the brief opening part of one of those. Let me see here. Bear with me for a moment. And so you definitely see a big shift in terms of views of both soldiers and the war, I think, when you look at the later genre of films, which includes films she writes about looking at, especially like Platoon and Hamburger Hill, Full Metal Jacket. I'm trying to remember the other ones that she includes in there. And so I'm going to show you a short clip from Full Metal Jacket. Let's see if I can get it. Oh, it's on DVD.
Yeah, there's no remote.
There isn't. Shoot. So I wanted to show the trailer. Wow.
Load it in your laptop and show it off.
Yeah, I'll do that quick. I did want to show you the trailer because the trailer kind of does the trick for us. So as I do that, I will continue to babble. But after Heidi's arguments, which I think you'll see in Full Metal Jacket and you'll probably get more sense of, is in that period in the late 80s, you get into the same mode that I think still kind of exists today when you see the Iraq War films, which is very supportive of the soldiers that are there, even if the film overall is kind of against the war itself. And I think you still see that a lot in the films today. When you see this newest group of films that are coming out. Just give it a second to load here. Problem is we said too many ways to use this stuff, right? All right, so now, keeping in mind what we just saw with John Wayne, we're gonna see a little different version here. Okay, so right away, we're gonna watch just the opening part of this too, but right away, what mood do you get from that trailer that's different from the Green Berets? What immediately do you see as different? Go ahead.
Definitely, the war is dehumanizing, and also that the grunts on the ground don't seem to have much respect for their commanding officers, who are a bunch of stuffed shirt blowhards. Very different from John Wayne, the heroic commander who can rally everybody together.
Yeah, so there's definitely a different look in terms of soldiers and officers and who's in charge and what their goals are, and that definitely, right? What else?
Well, I think Kubrick is, along with that, pointing to the hiatus of fragging that went on during the Vietnam War, higher than any other war, because there really was an issue with the chain of command. And Kubrick does a great job of exposing the sort of populist sentiment underneath with the troops that generated a lot of that, and how it was being backfed through the media in mainstream media in the United States at the time. Walter Cronkite reference.
And some of it is, of course, you know, the Green Berets would be much more professional soldiers, whereas this is reflecting draftees. So there is a little bit of a difference in the story being told, but the automatic mood you get is very different, right? The war is lost, whereas you wouldn't get that from the Green Berets. So this is the opening sequence. We're just gonna watch a little bit. So again, compare the two. John Wayne, he's yelling out to this detachment who's in training, and they're yelling back, we're airborne, whatever. And then you go to the opening sequence of this, and what do these guys look like? Right, as they're getting their heads shaved.
They look like sheep.
They look like sheep. Lambs to the slaughter a little bit. What else? I mean, obviously Stanley Kubrick has a particular vision in mind when he's making this film, right? What else did you notice? What else kind of gives you that sense of mood?
It just seems more real, like the way people really speak instead of the John Wayne film seems a little like propaganda. Like it's cleansed of the dirtiness.
Okay, a little idealized, much again like the World War II genre, like the older World War II films were very much that way too. It looks like you're watching an ad for it almost.
I like the way the music was saying one thing and then their faces were saying the exact opposite.
Yeah, and you have a different use of music there, right? Especially compared to the first one, which is this Green Berets, very glorification.
I might have missed this, so I apologize if I did, but this is the guy who made Dr. Strangelove. So it's, even though time has passed from the Green Berets to this film, he was kind of there already.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, right. So what this gives you is two things. One is, the social perception of the war and how that shifted. The other part you see are the way the perspectives of the people making the films is very different, right? You have John Wayne, who obviously comes from a particular political view, and Stanley Kubrick, who's coming from a very different view. So you see two effects of two different things. One is the social period and the views of the people when the time reflecting the time they're making it. The other one is the people who are doing the writing, selecting the scenes, putting it together, have big control over what it's going to look like as well. So that's one thing I want you to kind of keep thinking about. The next time you're in your class and you're thinking, well, I need to show a film on this event. You're not just selecting a film because it shows a certain event, right? You're selecting a film because it shows a certain perspective on that event. There are 300 and some, Civil War films. Glory was the first one that showed anything on the African-American soldier's perspective after, I think it was the 300, I can't remember the exact number of films made. So, you're picking something not just because it's about a time period or event, you're picking it because it shows a certain perspective. So that's one of the big kind of takeaways, at least that I've gotten out of this. Research I've done. So we're going to go back. Okay, so that was a little bit of a breakaway from the documentary, but I do that because documentaries do very much the same thing. They reflect the social period, the political views of the people who make them, the ideological views of the people who make them. And they're making a lot of the same decisions in a documentary, albeit with some kind of this raw material, as they are in feature films. So there isn't that much difference, especially in newer documentaries, because they've actually adopted a lot of the same kind of narrative structures of feature films in terms of the way the story is being told. So that's one thing also to kind of keep in mind. And so I did have to look quickly. I looked up, Roger Ebert wrote a review of the Green Berets. And I wanted to share this because you can tell even there was a critical element at that time. And he wrote, "The Green Berets," this is in 1968, "simply will not do as a film about the war in Vietnam. It is offensive not only to those who oppose American policy, but even to those who support it. At this moment in our history, locked in the longest and one of the most controversial wars we have ever fought, what we certainly do not need is a movie depicting Vietnam in terms of cowboys and Indians. This is cruel and dishonest and unworthy of the thousands who have died there." So, even at that time, John Wayne's a little late. Right? You get the sense that at least in the media, the tide has turned a little bit. And this is after Tet. It came out in 68, and that was January of 68 was Tet, right? Yeah. New Year? And so the film came out after the Tet Offensive. So it's interesting timing-wise in terms of what the two films show, too. But one of the things I found was this, what I'm calling the History Channel effect, is really ingrained in students' minds, and so we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at why. So this was a part of a study I did. This was actually a unit on World War II, and I asked them to rank 4 of the different sources they used as part of the unit in terms of which ones they would trust. And documentary film came out to be the most trustworthy source that they had above textbooks even. So in students' minds, and again, depending on how the teacher's using it, they really take these as very trustworthy, objective sources of information. And this is Hiroshima, The Decision to Drop the Bomb, which I don't know if you've seen that or not. It's a very powerful documentary on, and it does give kind of reasons on both sides of the use of the atomic weapons, but the imagery is really powerful against in terms of the victims of the nuclear bombs and the destruction of them. So we have a little more data on that coming in a little bit later. So the second part of, or factor that I'm saying is in this History Channel effect is the nature of watching historical documentaries. So how are we socially involved in watching documentaries or these types of films? And what we found is they've become, to some degree, a central part of where a lot of people are learning their history from. We're not seeing, kids aren't going out and reading a book. If they're talking about something in history class, what I kept seeing in the studies I've done is the teacher would say, well, where did you get that from, or where did you see that? And the two answers were either it came from like a parent, an older relative, something to that effect, or it came from a film or the History Channel or something like that. These were the things that kept coming up time and time again. This is the same thing Weinberg found. And back to Rosenstone here, he says that in his mind, documentary films are even more problematic as historical sources, because even historians, journalists, and the general public are much more trusting. So we see both the trust from this view of what that would mean to be a documentary, and also this social role now that documentary films hold. And here's a little bit, this is one of the interviews I was doing with students in this study. And she was talking about, I was asking them where they learned their history from and what they liked. And she said, well, my grandpa's really into history, and so I talked to him a lot about it. He kind of got me interested in it. I watched a DVD on World War II that my grandpa bought for me. I like to watch that one a lot. And so what she kept talking about was, as they're sitting socially talking about these films, the parents or grandparents are talking about their experiences during this time, and there it even lays more weight to what's being shown in the documentary. Okay? And this was especially on Vietnam, and this is what Weinberg and those folks found, was that generations are talking about history while they're watching the film, and so it's actually leading more credence to it as a historical source. And this female student went further and said, I like to see all the old footage because it is what actually happened. And so this view of documentaries is coming out. It's not like somebody acting it out, you get to actually see it. I like to watch all the old planes and people. I don't know, it's just interesting. So again, we're seeing both the views and that's a social connection. And what Weinberg and folks in the article that you're reading, they went on to even say the historical community writ large still doesn't want to believe that films actually have an impact on what people know about the past, or that they can be works of history in themselves, which is what Rosenstone would argue. And so they included this part, which I thought was good to include. He said, even historians such as the president of the Organization of American Historians begrudgingly recognize film as the predominant influence on students' historical understanding. Rather than pretending that we can do away with popular culture, we might try instead to understand how its forces can be marshaled rather than spurned or simply ignored. And this is because they kept finding the film that popped up in their study was Forrest Gump. That what they're referring to when they're talking about Vietnam was actually Forrest Gump, which is problematic on all sorts of levels, right? But it happened to be such a popular film because it was PG-13. It wasn't like Full Metal Jacket where the guy's, swearing every other word and is violent. And so many people saw it, and so they're talking about the history that was, blipped into Forrest Gump, and it was a very central to all these people's, to all these families' discussions. And they actually went out to households and talked to multiple generations of people in their study. The third part then of this History Channel effect is the technological advances, and your project is a good example of this. Right? 20 years ago, there wasn't a streaming server that could have hundreds of hours of cut footage that all these people could access. Instead, you could have one guy in a basement in Boston who could look through the old, the film reel footage and tape it together. So we've got huge advances in how documentaries can be made, and huge advances in how they can be distributed, which has a lot of pluses, I think, for us as teachers, but it's also got some limitations in terms of being able to evaluate these things. One thing that I found a lot lately is because of the filtering policies in a lot of schools, they aren't able to bring in video from some of these other groups that have been able to produce films. They can't bring in things that have been created by teachers and posted on YouTube. They can't do that. But what they are bringing in is things like United Streaming, which, is anybody using United Streaming in New York? Do you know what that is? it's basically a big video database from like the Discovery Channel and all those, and that you can go in and search and bring little clips up, kind of like the system that you saw, but it's all these commercially produced documentaries. So again, this is where they're drawing all their sources from, and you don't even know the context of what the video's in. You just search Tet Offensive, and you would get 5 clips that have 30 seconds or a minute or whatever of information on the Tet Offensive, and that's what they're showing in their classes. And so that has some problems in it, kind of all of its own. And so what we're seeing, especially on places like the History Channel effect, so this is what you used to have to make film. Okay? Now you've got this, or I added this for you all. This, right? So now you're able to access and use it, you know, in much the same way of what took all this work and all this equipment 20 years ago. And so this is a problem on places like the, oops, what is that? In places like the History Channel, because as I mentioned before, these are the types of things you're seeing. So you might see something on, if you're watching the History Channel, on the Ohio Grassman, another one, classic of these. Or as we like it down in our part of the world, the Chessie, which is the Loch Ness Monster in the Chesapeake Bay. Or a documentary on cold cut production featuring the olive loaf. I saw this one too. Or what I think is the most interesting, which is an episode of The Universe, which was on the difficulties when we make the mission to Mars of actually physically having sex in space. That's very physiologically difficult to pull off. So this is what kids are seeing when they turn to the History Channel. And one of the issues is, as I've sat out in classes observing student teachers, one of my cooperating teachers as an extra credit assignment was to go and watch something for the History Channel and just write about what you saw. No differentiation of what that show was on the History Channel, but just the History Channel was mentioned as one of the things. And there's been a number of other articles that have brought up the same thing, that they're praising students for watching the History Channel in class. That when it comes up, this is the reaction of teachers. And so we have to keep in mind, which brings us to the fourth part, is how we're positioning students in the classroom to documentaries and how we're using it. So if you're praising your students for watching the History Channel, what they might be watching, you know, is Champ, right? The Lake Champlain monster on Monster Quest, okay, or whatever else it is I'm trying to, well, my wife's addicted, remember, so I've seen a lot of them. And so the study that I did was in these 2 teachers, and I wanted to bring it back to the Vietnam part. One of the documentaries they used, which we're going to use some scenes from later, was Letters Home from Vietnam, which was an HBO production. Is anybody familiar with this one? It was an HBO production. I just saw the same guy did a Letters from Iraq, which I haven't seen, but it was basically from soldiers who died, their letters home, was how the video was structured around it, with famous actors reading the letters with a whole bunch of things intercut, and you'll see it. But this is the reasoning that the 2 teachers in my study, this is why they selected it. And what I think what they found out as we were going throughout the study was films they were selecting were films that they liked, which happened to reflect their views. But they were using them in the classroom very objectively. And again, part of it was this belief is because it's a documentary, therefore it's okay to do that. By the end, when I was talking with them about it, they started to say, oh, well, yeah, it does kind of show my views, but you know, there really isn't anything else out there that shows another view. Okay, that's the types of things that it say. But the 2 teachers, one said, I think that Letters from Vietnam, and this is why they're selecting it, continues the whole stream of consciousness about war is bad, war is horrendous. And the other one, who was much more blatant about her views, to show that the war was really messed up and a real big struggle from almost every person's point of view. That's not even close to being accurate, is it? So also what we're seeing is a reflection of, and this is something else from the Weinberg study that's interesting, they would go out and look, and students today, and this is the way textbooks are structured too, would believe that the majority of the population of the United States was against the war like in 1968. And that's just really not true at all, right? So it's also the way the collective memory around Vietnam is interesting too, because what they've seen are these films and things that have come out that really have this anti-war spin to them. So now, this is what they told their students when they were going to show this, and both of them used the film and then wanted students to deliberate on what their position on the Vietnam War would have been. So take a look and see how they're positioning their students. So Mrs. Johnson said, keep in mind, this is what she actually said in class, keep in mind that many of the boys you're going to see in the film were 18 and 19 years old. That's like 3 years older than you guys. So I want you to kind of think about what would have been like for you and how it feels. This is the first war where we have the technology to have reporters on the ground following the troops. So all the footage is real. Those are actual soldiers. Those are people getting killed and shot, being carried in. And she actually wants students at the end to say, you know, would you been against it or for it at the end of watching this film, with the film being the largest part of information on the Vietnam War that they're going to get. The other teacher, again, a little more blatant, and she actually gave them a worksheet that had these compelling reasons and had them listed. Look for at least 3 psychological, sociological, and practical reasons for why the U.S. was destined to lose the Vietnam conflict. So right away, she's positioning students this way, and she actually asked the students at the end to say, would you have enlisted? Would you have followed the draft if you were drafted? Would you have, I can't remember, like protested or ran away or something else? And she realized afterwards that was a bad question because all the female students in her class wouldn't have been under the draft anyway, so it was a bad item. But this is how she's framing students to it, basically saying, you know, look for all these reasons why I was destined to lose, and then decide if you're going to support it or not. Okay, but it's an open question. So it's kind of an open question, and they're giving them the right answer. And so at the end I asked them, well, what is the point of view of the people who made the film? And what I framed it as was really interesting. So you can tell in the 2 classes, and this was both for the Hiroshima film and for letters, these were the responses of the number of students in the class. So for letters, about half the students said it was anti-war. Another, a little over a third, said it was neutral, which a lot of them said it was balanced because it had something from kind of what they saw as both points of view, therefore it was balanced. Some of them said it was for the war. And when you see the film, this is really an interesting take on it. Although when I started talking with them, I won't mention where this study was done, but let's just say that it had a largely big history with the anti-war movement. So a lot of the parents, in fact, one of them said his mom was tear gassed. What I found was the ones who said it was actually supportive of the war was because the film was much more positive than what they heard at home, that they saw it therefore as supportive of the war. So it's all kind of context related in terms of what they were hearing at home. This was a much, even though this is really an anti-war kind of film, it was still more positive than what they saw. So it's all very context related in terms of when you get to your students. Okay. So we have these 4 kind of ways of leading what I'm calling this history channel effect, and then I was thinking, well, what the heck are teachers supposed to do about it? So we're going to look at a number of different ways, and they all kind of center around basically critical literacy goals. Come on. And the first and easiest is for us as teachers to stop looking at documentaries as objective notions of documentary, okay? And what I've been really thinking a lot about is trying to get teachers to think more about what documentary filmmakers are trying to do. What are their goals in making these films? Because they have a real specific reason for doing it, and they do think they want them to be in education. They want them to be used in education, but what they would say is they aren't just telling the story of an event. They would say they're trying to tell a story that has a particular view on the event. And Robert Coles, who did a work called Doing Documentary Work, which is, if you're interested in this, is a really good book. He puts it this way. He says, consider the viewpoint basically of the documentarian. And he says they all often, and he said this is somewhat contentious, but their attempt is something that summons the narrative side of the verb document, as opposed to its more specific reference to the accumulation or designation of various items as firm proof of something. So basically he's saying they aren't trying to tell the objective story of something. They're trying to frame it in a narrative that's interesting to an audience and that puts across a certain perspective. They don't think they're being objective. If you asked any documentary filmmaker, they wouldn't say they are. Now, educational film maybe, but not documentary film. Okay? And so I think this is one thing that we as teachers need to think about too, is the way that we're framing it for students. And so we're going to look at a few different ways to do this. So one is to get students to think about the choices of the producers of the film, writers, directors, people who are doing the interviews, people who are selecting the stock footage that they're using, because stock footage is really problematic. It's often used out of context. This is the reason why Holocaust deniers have any, usually this is one of the openings that they use, is that images, there's millions and millions of pictures out there that relate to the Holocaust. But yet when you see what's actually used in publications and films, it's a very, very small number, because we've found these iconic kind of images of the Holocaust that are used over and over again. And the problem is they're often used out of context. And so that opens the door for Holocaust deniers to then say, well, that picture wasn't in this city, this was in another city, and therefore none of it's true, right? I mean, it gives you a window into it. And so in the same way, a lot of documentaries, they pick a picture because it's powerful, they pick a stock footage clip because it's very powerful, not because it necessarily relates exactly to what they're saying. And so that's one thing. The selection of evidence that's used, and we're going to look at a different Vietnam, or a section of the film that's on Vietnam, that the filmmaker uses a very creative use of multiple forms of evidence that he's trying to make his point with visually and audibly, one of those words. You can cut that from the film. So really trying to get the author's perspective on it, and also the audience that they're trying to talk to. Okay, so John Wayne, who was that 1968 film made for?
Silent majority. Sorry.
I mean, really, who was he thinking of when he was making that film? Okay, versus Stanley Kubrick when he's making, Dr. Strangelove. Who was he thinking of when he's making that film? Who are the intended audiences, and what's the intended read of it? Which is, these are kind of film studies things, but I think they can be helpful to think through. So we're going to do a number of exercises, and I'm going to apologize in advance that they're not in the order exactly of how we're going to use them. But I wanted to give you a packet of examples of things. These are either things that I've used or that I've taken from teachers who I've studied and what they've used, or I use them a little bit in different ways. But I wanted to give you some examples of kind of activities you can do in your class to help students to start to think of some of the things I've talked about. And so the first one I want to take you to is actually one of the storyboards. So it's about midway in your packet. There's two versions of it. You can pick either one. One of the first things in media literacy, and when you're actually making film, is to understand all of the decisions that go into making any piece of film, is to do a reverse storyboard. So do you know what I mean by a reverse storyboard? So you know what a storyboard is, where they're going to go through and plan out the different scenes that they're going to have, the text that's going to be in there, the transitions or things that are going to use, maybe the sound effects. Well, what I have them do is do a reverse storyboard, which means I show them a short clip of something and record down what's used from it. So it gets them to think about the choices in terms of what's being used in the sound, what's being used in the text, what kind of ways is the film spliced together, are they using transitions, is it a really rough cut? And so one of the best ways to do this is with ads, because they're short. And so today we're going to use probably one of the most famous ads that was only used once. Which is a campaign ad from 1964, and I believe it was actually only run once. Is that right? Does anybody know?
I think that's right.
So this is the infamous Daisy Girl ad, or something to that effect, from 1964 from Lyndon Johnson's campaign. Let's see if I'm gonna. And so what I want you to do, once this catches up, is just humor me a little bit and try in this very short 30-second commercial to do a reverse storyboard of the different cuts that you're going to get. And actually you have to do this, you have to play it multiple times with when you're doing it with students, because it takes a while to do. Usually I do it once without the audio to get the visual part down, and then come back and do the audio. But bear with me and try to see what he's using here. Okay, it's always interesting. If you don't use this site, it's the Living Room Candidate, and it has a lot of ads from, when's the first one? 52 on. It even has one from Kennedy's campaign that was only shown in Spanish Harlem with Jackie speaking in Spanish, which is a neat one too. What do you see? And I'm sorry, I kind of stalled, but hopefully you got a sense of it. If you were looking at that, what's the transition that they use visually, kind of what happens in the scene? So you start obviously with this girl, and what's your reaction to this girl? What are they trying to get across here? She's cute, innocent, all-American girl standing in a meadow of flowers. All right, exactly, this Americana image, right? And what's she doing? She's plucking the little things, right? This is, kind of this idealized version of life in a free America. Although the math curriculum we're going to work on a little bit still. See, it's not an issue before now. It was an issue back in the 60s too. And then what is the filmmaker doing here, or the ad maker doing to try to start to get you think of the seriousness that they lead to? What is the camera? How does it cut to?
Zooms in on our eye.
Starts to zoom right into our eye. What message is that sending? Do you think? How does it make you feel?
It's kind of like this idea of bearing witness to this potential for destruction.
So it could be her future. It's kind of, you're going to see her future if you don't choose Johnson. What else? One nice thing about doing these in your classroom and students get their takes on it is that you do start to hear the different ways that people read things, which is always a good thing for students to hear too. That's not objective, that people are looking at it in different ways. What other reactions did you have to that part? So one is that this could be your future. What else?
Looking through her eyes.
You're going to see something through her eyes. What else?
But you have to answer to her with your decision, that your sort of, that your decision to vote or not vote is ultimately,
Okay.
Doing something to this girl.
Great. What else? What are other people's reads on that? It's kind of a gut unnerving reaction, isn't it? Anytime you zoom in really close on something, it's either trying to make you a little nervous or trying to shake you up a little bit. Okay, so then she's counting down, and then it goes to what? What do you hear in the background?
Johnson.
Before Johnson, what do you hear? As she's kind of counting down with the flowers, you start to hear what in the background? Anybody catch it?
Countdown.
You start to hear a countdown to what? A missile launch or something to that effect, right? Okay, so they're giving you the vision of, and then you see the big mushroom cloud. So if you don't vote for Johnson, what's going to happen? Nuclear holocaust, right? And then you go to Johnson's voice, which how did Johnson's voice affect you this time? Right? So and then he says what? We must all love each other or we must die. All right? We think of campaign ads today, people always say how harsh they've gotten. You should start watching some of these old ones. It's really amazing. Okay, so they're very trying to get this powerful image across. You're looking in her eye and what you're seeing is a mushroom cloud. And then you're saying, well, if you want to see this, if you don't want to see this happen, vote for Johnson. Okay? But in that little 30-second thing, if you were going to actually fill out a storyboard for it, you'd have to fill out 3 or 4 different little kind of scenes, wouldn't you? And there's a lot that goes into the production of a little short piece. And the same thing goes into longer documentaries, which we're going to get into in a second.
Wasn't Goldwater promising to win the war by actually using the nuclear weapon in Vietnam?
He could very well have.
I'm pretty sure that was part
That might have been the response of it.
I think that's part of where this was coming from.
It could be, although it was only showed once, and I'm not sure in what context it was shown. I think it was so bad or so sharp that they just pulled it because they got too much negative feedback from it. But yeah, that could have very well been.
It in the first place is because of what are the same thing to do.
Yeah.
It's full frame.
So that's kind of one way to get at this idea of critical literacy. We're going to look at a couple of different exercises. Oops, sorry, she's playing on there now. A couple other ways is to start to look at the narrative structure of documentaries, and we're going to look at, this time, Dear America, Letters Home from Vietnam. And what I want you to do, and you can reproduce these storyboards, they're just generic ones from somewhere, but they can be useful sometimes. In the packet, so you have a few things here. The first opening page is we're going to use in a little bit. The second one, this is a version, this is one of my former students that she uses an episode of The Twilight Zone called Monsters on Maple Street, which is really Red Scare, kind of evocative of, and sometimes the old TV series can be nice because again it gives you this feeling of the social, and in this case kind of social criticism of the time. But they're made to be, 23 minutes long, it's a half-hour episode, so they're pretty short and you can use them all in one 50-minute period. So this is an example of what she used, which I gave it to you because the second page, one of the things we found in our research is that you need to give students a job during the viewing, but not necessarily answering really detailed questions. So you want to think of a job that's going to drive students to watch the film closely and critically and get out of it what you want them to, versus kind of distracting them away from it. And so what she did here was had them list on this page what happened in the episode and then how people reacted to it. Because there's a number of these events that happen along the way that escalate as it's the Maple Street's this little Maple Street, USA, kind of this idyllic neighborhood as the neighbors start turning on each other because of what happens. But so she had them actually watching the film, charting what was going on. So something like this is an example of a good exercise during a film. The next part in here is the motion picture analysis worksheet from the National Archives. I just gave that to you as an example. They have one of these for all sorts of different sources. You might want to take a look at those. They're in the digital classroom on the National Archives site. And then after the storyboards, this is the one that we're going to use. And this is actually an example I used with a documentary in my class called I Sit Where I Want, which is on a deseg. It's students in a Buffalo high school trying to desegregate their cafeteria. Because I use it in my class because it raises all sorts of issues in terms of both the documentaries side and also issues of kind of race, of segregation, of the impact of desegregation. It even has issues of like acting black and those kinds of things in it. So we use it as kind of a center point for discussion. But what I found was when I try to do a discussion on a film, when we do Socratic seminars, is that you don't have the text in front of you. So you need to find a way for students to collect the data they need for the discussion during the viewing. And so what I started to have them do to both get at kind of the affective side of what's going on and also this information to refer back to was to chart. So every chunk of this film, I would have them record certain amounts of data. One was what actually happened, what they saw, what their kind of affective kind of emotions were from it, the impact it had on, which is the feeling part, and then the thinking part, so what questions did it raise in their minds. The other thing I found with discussions of films is that they would sit there and say, well, yeah, the big white guy, and things like that. So that's why I started giving them a chart with names on it and their pictures, so that then when we had a discussion, they could actually say, well, Mike, when Mike did this, it saved us a lot of time in the discussion, everyone could follow along. They didn't have to constantly describe things. So if you are going to do a film discussion with a lot of characters in it, I would recommend doing something where they can refer to the people by name if it's not going to be obvious. But what we're going to use this chart for is I'm going to show you two different clips out of Letters Home from Vietnam. One from the very beginning of the film and one from about midway. And what I want you to, we're going to chart this just like we have here, but what we're going to look at is kind of the progression of the narrative of the documentary and how it's going to lead us to kind of what the filmmaker wants you to feel about it. And so I'm going to show you two clips. And so on this one, if you want to just use the first two blocks that are in there, that would be great. And they're each about 4 minutes, I think. Get rid of the Daisy Girl here. And so this was put out in, I think, '87, and it was an HBO production that they put together and showed. And like I said, it was made basically centered around all these letters of soldiers. I'm going to show you, I think this includes the beginning part. And I want you to notice again how they're describing the film and how they're positioning kind of you as the viewer to what you're seeing. But this would also kind of fit in that same thing that the noble grunt vintage of or genre of films. Okay, so what I want you to take a minute and fill out those sections on the chart that I gave you in terms of what you saw in the clip, your reaction to it, and maybe what questions it raised. Let's give you a couple minutes. Yeah, you don't have to use the chart if you want to just write down your impressions on something else. I'm going to just give that to you as an example. Give you another minute or so to finish this up. Move on. So before we move on to the second clip, what I want you to do is with a person that's kind of next to you or nearby or a group of three, I want you to share with each other kind of your impressions of that first clip. Maybe we'll do a little think, pair, share. Might as well model our pedagogy, right? So, as I do with my students, I always have to be explicit about what I'm doing, let them know, especially when I'm doing my classroom management skills. Right? If I have to go over a babbling, you gotta go stand close to them and I'll say, what am I modeling now? And then they both be quiet and they realize that they can use proximity to make people be quiet. What I want you to do right now then is just talk to them and share with them what were your reactions in terms of what you saw in it, how it kind of engaged you or how it made you think about it, and then what questions it raised for you. Just to see how each person's gonna see this a little bit differently. So take a couple minutes with the person next to you and do that now, please.
Oh, good.
I started with these images of kind of wholesome, innocent young men playing on the beach. They were playing on the boardwalk, which is sort of a fun, feel-good song of the early 1960s. And then that transitions into these images of warfare and brutality and the jungle terrain of Vietnam, and we hear the cynical
Quite blew out music, but it was real mellow, and then just suddenly greetings, and then also bodies, these healthy bodies to mutilation. Those things were
there was this lost wife and then struck down in the pond. And that was pretty much my take on it.
Right. This was probably the first time people, word that way.
The music was very, just iconic, like 60s type music, and I felt like it gave me a different sense while I was watching it, how the graphic images it like it was a confusion of usually
I just see really sad
Right.
It was just like, why did I want to do this again? Because I wanted to
Yeah.
This was from people who died in the
Yeah.
You know what, they had this reaction to it. They loved this thing. The music they heard was the same stuff that they were hearing. Again, it was really interesting. The role that they did.
Oh yes, yeah. Oh, the Wipeout. Yeah.
I'll give you a couple minutes left in your groups to finish up on this first section before we bring it back together.
Right.
I don't know.
Right.
You know that you cried or you saw this, the first time that you saw that you were that kind of emotion.
his
right? Like
his sort of his dissatisfaction. Yeah.
See things that you didn't see.
There's a real sense of contempt that he had to report this, that he was really disgusted by the number of casualties.
Unless it's something that, you know, would be closer to graffiti or not, right? So I'm always a little leery of showing video because I want to know how like intellectual
I'm not a teacher.
You really missed that one. The clip of David Berkeley.
I was maybe 8 when these were showing, you know, the actual. I remember these footage, so it doesn't mean.
Okay, I'm gonna bring us back together.
So I would be leery of making them react that way. But
Okay, let's hear from a few of the groups in terms of what were your reactions to this first clip. Is that lawnmower?
I don't know what's going to be outside. I checked before I couldn't find it.
Okay, what were some of your reactions? What about this group back here? What was your reaction to this first clip? Cher?
I think, you know, we all talked about the contrast at the beginning. I mean, I think, you know, just the idyllic scene of young men enjoying themselves on the beach and mellow music, and then, you know, cut to the rock music and the scenes of then
The
dead
warfare
bodies and the
bodies.
warfare.
Yeah, so those two scenes kind of start you out going, you know, it gets you off balance a little bit almost, showing kind of this idyllic beach and the surf and kind of, you know, what maybe people at home were doing. And then all of a sudden cuts to that. What about the very intro part? Did you read through what was scrolling through there?
Well, and I was looking more like just the visual content, but yeah, there was the emphasis again that this is very real life, that these are actual scenes, and then the text and everything was very plain and simple, looked very documentarian-like.
Mm-hmm.
And the music was quite sad, and the image, this solo image of this guy up there in kind of this antique purpley thing. So that came along, and then it really cut very quickly to the surf scene.
Yeah.
So the juxtaposition was so strange. But knowing how usually things work in films, you're always going to come back to the beginning near the end at some point. So it's like a precursor that eventually.
Yeah, in the front they tell you right away that it's that these are letters from soldiers that died. So it gives you a little bit of this bearing witness kind of thing, doesn't it? What are you gonna
Since
say?
this is not a reenactment, and then they say they thank these actors for reading the voices.
Yeah, I got a kick out of that. It says nothing in this film is reenacted. This is all real footage. Thanks to the actors who read it. You know, right after the next paragraph it says that. So here they're setting you up saying again, this is real, this is, you know, we haven't, and what they mean is, you know, obviously none of the footage has been, you know, reenacted, but these letters are being read in a certain way, and it doesn't say anything about footage being used out of context. I mean, it shows those soldiers writing the letters. Well, did they really have film of the actual people who they were reading in the background, writing the letters? No, of course they didn't. They went and found film that they could from the stock footage to show that to support what they're showing in the film, right? Okay, what other reactions did people have from the other groups? Anything different?
Just with the use of the CCR song, just the question of who is serving in this war, and just in terms of prestige and the critique of, I guess, the draft.
Yeah, definitely this film uses music very heavily to very powerful effect, I would say, and especially kind of popular music. I don't know if that's the HBO thing or what it is, but the one reaction I got from the students that were in the study I did, because this film was used in it, and because of where they were, you know, it was the music they heard their parents playing at home, because it was this group of parents that happened to be heavily anti-Vietnam. You know, those were the songs they identified with. So the kids in class really got into the film, in part, they said, because they recognized a lot of the music that was in it. All right, so now we're going to watch the second section. If you want to kind of do the same thing, and what we're going to kind of think about is, this is a way you can get your students to think about how films are structured to kind of tell this story over the course of a film, is to break it into smaller pieces and get their reactions at different points. So this is about the middle of the film, I think maybe a little bit towards the end. Okay, do the same thing here then. Just kind of record your reaction to this little clip. Give you a few minutes to do that. Okay, let's go ahead and, sorry if I'm cutting you off a little short, but let's go ahead and do the same thing, talk to the person or people right around you, and share what your reactions were to this clip then, which is, like I said, a little bit past halfway, I think, through the film. And notice here they're using the same close-up on the eye thing that we saw in that to show the emotion and show it throws you off a little bit. So take a few minutes and talk to the people right around you about this clip and what it caused in you.
Oh, that's okay. Oh, no problem.
Because I did recognize him this time. It's Sean Penn, I guess.
Yeah.
Maybe Harvey got that.
Yeah, the ending, the juxtaposition of the music.
It's like the music interprets what you're seeing, or
So go ahead.
voices wake up.
Sure.
It does all.
Well, we're only seeing a small portion of the film, so it might not be representative. But I was struck that we're hearing letters from soldiers who are clearly very disillusioned. They feel very dehumanized, and we're not getting anything from any other perspective. I mean, there must have been letters that were written in Vietnam where there was a sense of confidence about the mission and a sense that something really constructive was happening. We're going to liberate these people. We're going to create a better society in Vietnam. There must have been people who felt that way. And maybe those letters are in the film. We're not getting any of that here. And then with the music, what's going on is very anti-war stuff. I didn't recognize the second scene was also meant to create a sense of
So it is making a strong argument, right? The music and the footage and the letters shows you just kind of accompany that argument.
It makes you wonder if they're
right.
Saying, this is rough.
Again, it's taking the images out.
Ideologically, this is the responsibility. And I mean, you would think if you were a 15-year-old sitting in a classroom watching this for the first time, how could you not just sort of
and I thought most of the actor readings were really good, but I was totally taken out of the film the minute De Niro came on, because De Niro's voice is so distinctive. Immediately it feels like a movie.
Okay, I'm going to cut you a little short this time because we have one more film that we're going to get to, one more activity. But what reaction did you have to this film clip? And notice again, we have a little bit between the two scenes. There's a real message that starts to build here, I think, as even though you were watching short clips, you start to see kind of how the different parts are connected and what the author of the film wants to do. What was your reaction to this one? Go ahead.
It felt very strongly anti-war, because there's a juxtaposition of images of soldiers being evacuated from the battlefield, injured soldiers, with the Marvin Gaye song What's Going On, which clearly has an anti-war perspective. And the letters that we're hearing are only from soldiers who feel very disillusioned and dehumanized by the experience of war.
In this section of the film, right, they go from the first part of it, basically says, it questions war, I'm not questioning this war, but war in general. And then the next part goes to kind of the consequences of this war, right? You see Miley, you see basically soldiers who are talking about basic PTSD, right? They're talking about being hollow, about drinking, doing that. So it's kind of the consequences on both U.S. soldiers and on the Vietnamese, the consequences of war, right? So that message starts to build in this kind of segment here, definitely very strong.
I'm just curious, are there any moments in the film where you hear letters from people who felt a real sense of confidence and purpose being in Vietnam?
There's a little bit more at the beginning, kind of, like the ones that you heard at the beginning, there's a little bit more of that, like they have some purpose of being there, but not too much.
Okay.
No, not too much. If I remember right. It's been a while since I've watched the whole thing, but.
Have you seen the letters from Iraq?
No, I didn't. Honestly, I was looking up something on the director, and I noticed that was one of his other films was letters from Iraq or something to that effect.
I mean, so we were saying, or I was saying, because we've read Lizzie's War and the things they carried, and we've all been sort of immersing ourselves in this genre, that it's everyone. There's a theme that of being haunted, of being perplexed, like that very quizzical face of that young man. Like, what's this all about? Why am I here? And you surely don't get that sense from other war films that I've seen, although, my.
And this is 1987, again, this is that genre of films that's, because all these issues of all these vets now that have come home, all these things are arising in society as kind of the impact of what the war had on the folks that did come home, and that's really reflected in this film, right? At least that aspect of it. But trying to also be more sensitive to the vets that are there and the issues they're going through too. And this was the interesting thing Weinberg and them found, because they were using Forrest Gump, the image they were getting was that everyone in society looked at these soldiers as baby killers and that. And while there might have been a little bit of that going on, not everyone in the US looked at returning soldiers as bad people of this, right? I mean, there were a lot of parts in the States that were still pretty supportive of the soldiers at least coming home, if not the war itself. But in their image from the film, it was very much, they were all baby killers. But they were doing that to show that, when these guys came home, they did have a rough time of it, and they had a rough time of it over there, and they shouldn't be treated that way, right? And so this definitely reflects that kind of the sense in society now in the 80s that people are recognizing that this is an issue, the veterans that are coming home, and that they brought a lot of baggage home.
I think too what this speaks to is that there was sort of a cone of silence about Vietnam in most families. That people that returned simply never ever spoke of what happened there in any detail. And I think the 80s was really a sort of coming to grips with that for the first time publicly. And I read this film as an attempt to do that as a nation, what was going on.
And to go back to Margaret, all the World War II vets that were out there. That was the good war. That's now, the greatest generation. It would have been called that then. But, compared to that with Vietnam vets, it's a very different perception of how those people were welcomed back into society, when they came home and treated. Probably, and if you're going home and you're a Vietnam vet and your dad was in World War II or Korea, it was very different in terms of how it was accepted, right?
Yeah, and there's a lot of complexities. Like one of the excerpts for tomorrow is from oral histories from women who served. And on the other hand, they were very positive about their work, which most of the people in the book are Army nurses, but there's some who are from American Friends Service Committee.
And there's some of that in here too. They do get a couple nurses' letters.
They were, on the other hand, very positive, and I think one of the reasons is that their mission was very clearly articulated to them and more narrowly conceived. But on the other hand, when they came home, they also, like the men returning, had a lot of trouble, but for different reasons, because for them it was a very high moment of expertise. And over, all these people in this in the book that is in the readings of 26 oral histories, these women were able to do things in Vietnam as nurses or in these other jobs that when they came home and were employed in hospitals or whatever, they were not able to do, because they were not asked for that expertise, and they had to go into slots where it wasn't wanted. So they felt that they had been able to do something in Vietnam that they were not able to do at home. And that was a really different experience.
Yeah, so, the film, I think, it was interesting because at the time this data was collected in the spring of 2005. So this was about, getting into the second year after in Iraq too. So the context of which it was shown and what was going on too was really interesting in how students at that point were reading it because of what was going on in contemporary society, because things were starting to turn really even more critically in Iraq, especially where this was. Again, because of the kind of the views in the particular community.
May I ask you, when was this letters home? When was that?
87 it was put out. So, I don't know much more about it in terms of, how they went about selecting the letters or anything like that. I think that would be really interesting to find out how they went about it. It is interesting. Someone brought up, the thing I always get is the actors. Like certain letters I don't notice, but like Sean Penn's voice comes out clearly. Yeah. And De Niro's voice, and then you start thinking of Robert De Niro while you're, so there are some things that plays with you a little bit as you're listening to these types of films.
Do you know when the movie Coming Home was made?
No.
I'm just curious.
78.
That's what I thought.
78?
That's like significant. I was thinking that's a decade before this, but
Yeah.
it really took the same perspective. It was really about the impact on people coming home.
Yeah, and what you would think is, so where would that have been seen versus this is on HBO now? So it's become much more accepted by this point.
And that had Jane Fonda and John Voight and people who are often seen as being, very much to the left, who might have been people who would have, the other side might have said those were the people calling the soldiers baby killers, but
Yeah.
they actually took this perspective.
Yeah, no, that is interesting.
Yeah, I would just add, we were talking at lunch about the piece on the Charlton Heston anti-Vietnam War documentary, the PBS documentary. If you go to YouTube, you can find, I think it's called Accuracy in Media, and they say this is the real Vietnam story. And so it was made as a response to the WGBH series that did show prominently Jane Fonda in North Vietnam on her infamous trip over there, and she's smiling and laughing, and of course, though they chose those clips quite deliberately too, because she's, palling around with the Viet Cong, but it's worth checking out on YouTube to see the reaction, and they actually aired it on PBS because they felt they really had to, because the take of Charlton Heston and his group, and it wasn't the NRA, but it was that this was a very biased piece, a very biased documentary, so they wanted equal time to represent a more heroic understanding of the war with their own set of villains.
Yeah, and the thing I automatically tell people is that it's not that I wouldn't say you shouldn't use things like this in your classroom. In fact, I think they should, because of what we're finding in terms of the role of film and media in society. The thing is, though, you need to be more explicit about this is one certain perspective on it and help them to understand how it reflects the views of the folks who made it or what's going on at the time. And that if you are the issue with this particular class was that this was the biggest source of information, maybe they used their textbook a little bit, on Vietnam that they used. And they said, well, now you need to make up your mind on how you would stand on this issue using this one film. Okay, that's a little bit different, because you're saying this is an open question, but yet you're feeding them the right answer basically by giving this to them as the only source. So that's kind of the issue. It's more of a pedagogical one than actually showing the video. It'd be interesting to show this and then show the Charlton Heston one as comparison and have them compare the two films in terms of the views that they had or something. So it's I'm not anti-using films at all. It's just you need to be careful, I think, more so just be aware of the things that you're bringing into your classroom. So this one is our last activity. I'm going to try to get through this so we have a few minutes for questions. And maybe we'll just watch the first part of it. The front page of it that has we're looking mainly at perspectives here. And so we're going to watch a short clip of Errol Morris's film Fog of War, which was centered around Robert McNamara, who you saw a little bit earlier in the clip that Bill showed. And what I want you to do is, this is a really good one for looking at what evidence is the documentary filmmaker using to make their case. And this one has multiple perspectives on it, because you've got McNamara's perspective being kind of, as he's being interviewed, he's able to tell his story. And then you have another layer of Errol Morris's perspective on it by the way he's structuring the documentary. And it's interesting because it is largely the interview with one person, but it's easy to see kind of these two levels of how McNamara's message is being framed. So we're just going to watch a little bit of it. And mainly I want you to pay attention. Okay, this is good practice because we want to give you a job while you're viewing. Sorry, I'm a methods professor. It's hard to break from. Is really look at what types of evidence is the filmmaker using to either support or what's his message along with McNamara's. Okay, I'm going to stop it there.
Right once and
maybe. McNamara just wants to keep talking. So think about it for a second. What types of evidence is Morris using here to try to get his point across? What did you see in there? You have the testimonial from McNamara telling the story. What else? You have the phone conversations, right? What else is he doing kind of visually and with the music to try to get a certain message across to you?
Oh, the music is very somber.
Yes, I'm trying to remember what they described. It's Philip Glass who does a lot of these films. Yeah,
It's Discord.
I could see that.
it's like something dread. I can't remember how it was used, but that was how it was described.
It gives you the feeling that you're like on this doomed course, you know.
It does have this kind of dreadful doom approaching, right? Definitely.
But it's like it's not the doom of the torpedo; it's the doom of this sequence of events that we were wrong, you know.
Definitely. What else? What else is he using
It
here?
has those, the time and the date, and so, you know, there's like build up to a climax, and I feel like a lot of television police shows these days use the same, you know, sort of method.
Yeah, in terms of its structure, these are the newer documentaries, right? They're taking on a little bit different structure in terms of how they're framed and how they're telling the story. Now, you saw some of the same stock footage in here that you did in the earlier series, if you noticed from this morning too, which is interesting. The planes taking off from the carrier, one of the destroyer just showing the radar hut going around. What else do you notice though? Do you think they really had a camera in there on those sonar men on that particular day, knowing that there was going to be an attack coming? No. Okay, it's obviously like a training film or something. Did they really have the ones of those particular torpedoes coming at them? Well, of course not, because the torpedoes didn't exist. Although I do love the backwards torpedo coming up at the end, kind of as we're taking back that one, right? Okay, so you have to think about when you see these documentaries, what are all the pieces of evidence that they're using to kind of build this in? Here you had some real kind of, you know, primary sources of things in terms of the phone calls that are being used, in terms of a couple of the documents that are used and highlighted and selected from to try to make the case to either support or refute what McNamara is saying, right? But if you also notice when you're watching McNamara, and this is Errol Morris made this, and he uses a set of something he designed. He calls it the Interatron. I don't know if you've ever seen any other Errol Morris's documentaries, but if you notice he's looking directly at you into the camera. He designed a device where basically Errol Morris's image comes up over the camera, so when he interviews them, the people being interviewed look directly into the camera, and so it gives you this really straight on, it's a little unnerving. And so Errol Morris is actually sitting right next to the camera, but he's got this set of mirrors that shows him, so when they're answering the questions, they answer it directly into the camera, so it also sets you off a little bit that McNamara is a little creepy looking anyway. You know, it's constantly staring at you and answering in that way. One of the things that people notice about this, I'm cutting it a little bit short on this section. So, but you do have two perspectives here, because you have McNamara who's telling a story, who's trying to get out a little bit of the blame here for some of it, and saying that they're still justified on the first day, even though they were wrong on the second attack, right? But then you have Errol Morris kind of putting the story together in a certain way, using the music to raise questions, using these other phone calls, you know, building it in. So you've kind of got two layers here. And in a number of documentaries, you're going to see that. You're going to see multiple perspectives in there. Kind of the perspectives of the people who are being interviewed in there, and then how those perspectives are being used to get into this bigger overall story of what's there too. And Morris was really criticized. They said that he let McNamara off kind of in this film, like he wasn't critical enough of McNamara. And so that's another interesting thing, is to read some of the reviews of how it was received. Because in many people's mind, they view McNamara, you know, from that generation as, you know, the devil reincarnate.
Well, the old kind of documentary, which we were used to on TV, had what was called the voice of God narration,
Yeah.
which was like the third-person narrator of a novel, let's say.
Definitely.
And it just had this omniscient voice. And I think everybody, I don't know, kids in class might be too young to remember too many of those. But, you know, just the third-person narration. But the new kind has all talking heads, more interview.
More so, yeah.
More so, and then they set off one interview perspective against another interview perspective, and then they use these devices like putting the on-screen type, which sort of reinforces, you know, the voice that's coming and gives it a double weight.
It's interesting. Some documentary filmmakers are more open and transparent in what they're doing, and some aren't. In this one, you actually hear Morris yelling at him from behind it. You know, sometimes as he's interviewing, he's like, "Well, why'd you do that?" You know, you can hear him shouting at McNamara from it. And in other ones, they still want to keep kind of the interviewer, like there's no one there that's actually asking the person questions. Like this story is just coming out naturally. And so it is interesting to get students to think about that. And some new documentaries are much more transparent even. I was saying earlier, there's one called Banished, which is about these towns. Most of them are in the South, where basically African Americans were just booted out of town. And in that one, the guy who makes it, whose name now is slipping me, It's the same guy that did the 2 Towns of Jasper, Texas, and those. I can't remember his name right off the top of my head. I think he's a professor over at NYU, though, actually. He's actually in the film interviewing the people and asking them to tell the story and using it. So it's much more transparent in that there's someone, pulling this story out and that they have a role in the film, in the making of the film. And so I think you're seeing more of that in some documentaries, although a lot still are the kind of over narration that's basically telling you the truth that you should listen to because it is this kind of anonymous voice coming through.
I think the other thing that, McNamara is very appropriate that he's being interviewed here because the documentary accepts the logic that it was that event that led to U.S. involvement in the war, which we talked about earlier was not the case.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. was heavily involved and would remain involved if there was no Tonkin incident. I think that was, something that is, again, ironic because it was McNamara that was pushing for sending more and more advisors to Vietnam in the Kennedy administration. So I think that's kind of
and they do get into it a little bit, and they do a little bit more of that in the beginning, but notice here too, the way he's explaining what the resolution was, compared to what we were talking about this morning too, in terms of why they did it in that way, in terms of the authority in that too. So if you looked across, again, if you could search multiple documentaries for how they all compare or talk about that one incident and go across, it'd be really interesting then to have students look at why are the different perspectives out there. Because of the evidence that's available, because of the time when it was done, because of who they talked to, it'd be really interesting to see.
Interestingly, McNamara was not interviewed for the WGBH series. And remember, Mark and Maria, I said, do you know why? And so, so far, maybe someone will be able to tell us before the project is done. But it is, we don't have an answer now.
Considering he had such a hand in it all the way
completely.
up,
That's why I was shocked when I heard that. But this would be interesting to juxtapose with the WGBH because he's absent in the.
And again, this is made at a time, titled The Fog of War, because again, we're seeing Afghanistan and Iraq when this comes out. As you could read this as a little bit of a critique on that, obviously, as well, or at least raising some issues about it. So again, looking at the time of when something is produced as well is always, what is it really about Vietnam or is it about something else?
I think he was unwilling to be interviewed, and I think
He might have.
It was a great point for Errol Morris to get that because he, over the years, finally decided that he was going to.
Well, he'd written a book,
Yeah.
and this is the same title as the book,
Yeah.
the 11 Lessons from whatever it is, something like that. So I think he probably saw it as, which the book I think was for him too, was kind of his chance to tell his story. And that's also probably why Errol Morris didn't go too critical on this, is he wanted people to kind of decide for themselves and packaged it in this way, is my guess. But okay, I'm gonna stop there to give us a couple minutes for questions. Literally, sorry. Any questions? I threw a bunch at you, I apologize, without giving you much time for reflection. But I wanted to give you some ideas of how you can think about using things in your own classrooms, and also as you're selecting your own films, what to think about.
I have to first reveal myself as the parent of a teenage boy who's very interested in war and would very much like to be part of the war effort. And so I'm both watching all this stuff, and my main drive as a would-be history teacher is to connect kids with history. And film does it so effectively, and bad music does it even more effectively. And then you're right that the challenge becomes educating them about the ways the narrative is being manipulated, as with any other narrative. But because the connection is so visceral, how do you, for example, that footage of all those boys in Vietnam looking completely hollow, and as the narrative builds the case that this was totally meaningless, and these boys knew they were dying for no reason.
Yeah.
How do you deal with teenagers in the classroom faced with that? How do you? There's an emotional response or a psychological responsibility of the educator.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that I found is there's a couple of things. I've seen these things used in class and just let hang out there, right? They don't discuss it, they don't do anything. I mean, in fact, the other day I saw, this is a little horrifying, this is Virginia, but they spent 3 days watching, one of my student teachers was in class, that spent 3 days watching Jesus Christ Superstar to learn about historic Jesus.
Okay.
And then 30 minutes on all other world religions. And to me, anyway, we'll let that one go. But so I see, but because I do this research now, I hear people tell me all these little horror stories, or how 10 Commandments is used to teach about ancient Israeli history, which is another one I heard. Or, all these ones, and I'm kind of going, you know. But I hear all these things because this is my research area, so I think film is a really tricky one in that. But the two things that I've really found, one is that in order to have a good discussion, students need to be really well prepared to have that discussion, right? So that's what's drawn me to play with these different kind of instruments during the viewing and to give a student a job with what we're gonna have in mind at the end. So if you think of the Socratic seminar, you have them do some kind of a ticket to prepare for the discussion, same thing here. So if what you wanted to talk about was, well, what was the impact on these young people as a result of this war? This wasn't just Vietnam, right? We have all kinds of things now with World War II that soldiers came back with all forms of PTSD, just no one talked about it, right? In all wars, we probably had these things, but Vietnam, it became kind of really central to it because of the type of war it was to some degree too. So however you can frame them to prepare them for the discussion, you can. So what are you going to have them do during the viewing that will give them the information and prepare them to look at it in a certain way that then you can discuss it. And what I'm saying then is you need to add on that extra layer though, so you're not just talking about what's portrayed in the film, but the film itself. Okay, we sometimes get torn, we get all up into what's going on in the film story, not looking at the bigger picture. So how is it framed in society? You know, how does it reflect the time and the people who made it, and all of those things. And a Socratic seminar works well because that's what you're doing when you do literature that way, right? You're not just talking about the story or whatever you read, you're also talking about the author. Why did the author do this or that? So in my mind, that's why I've been doing a lot of these kind of modified versions of those seminars, but it takes time. So the thing I always tell them is if you're going to choose to show something, you know, this is why I don't think clips are necessarily a bad idea unless you do want to give them the idea of kind of that narrative arc across something. But you need to take the time then to help them debrief it because you are going to get different perspectives on it from a whole wide variety. As you can imagine, that Letters Home from Vietnam, I had some young boys who were in that class going, wow, you know, getting one read on it, while other kids were absolutely, you know, horrified by the violence in it. So you're going to get that wide range of perspectives across, and it's good for students to hear each other's perspectives on it. So yeah, so that's, I'm kind of not answering your question, but the big thing is, you know, really in terms of taking the time to debrief and discuss it, which takes a lot of time. And so I tell my students, if you're picking a feature film or a feature-length documentary, you're talking an hour and a half, you know, 2-3 class periods to get through it, plus another one for discussion. Is it really worth it? You know, or should you be spending your time on other things, or can you use a short clip from it and have basically this pretty close to the same effect? Yeah.
I'm just wondering, within the context of this project, you're troubling the notion of any kind of objectivity delivered through documentaries, and I think that's very valuable. Now that we have the capacity to take out the soundtrack and to go back to the raw materials and to see what the director didn't use, the temptation is to regard that as more access to objectivity that we didn't have before. And I'm wondering what your reaction to that is.
Well, I mean, you still have, they were asking certain questions. They picked those people for certain reasons, right? I mean, you still have a number of choices even going into the interviews that were there. But, you know, we were talking about this earlier, to see what was left out of that. You know, if you watched part of that series of where maybe that person was interviewed, you picked a segment that they did include the interview from, and then you watch some of the raw footage of what else they said, I think that's a really powerful thing in terms of talking about why did the filmmaker decide that was the part to pull out from it. You know, I think it can be really useful. The other thing, you know, that this project, and some of the other ones I've heard that are similar, is having students create their own documentaries from some of this stuff would be really interesting, because then the hope would be that then they would understand more of those choices that they made in creating their own, so that when they looked at other documentaries, they would get a better sense of what went into making it too. So I think, you know, I think you still can't say it's objective, because there are still going to be, you know, again, they're asking the questions and it's given within a certain context, but I think it's more raw, more primary than would be in a finished product for sure. It'd be the same way in that a diary or something, although a little bit less, because the diary is going to be more that person's thoughts and not driven by questions from somewhere else. But, you know, it'd be somewhat in the same way.